Hello, welcome everyone to Sport Tech Daily's episode with Simon Strachan. He's worked for the Qantas Wallabies as a video analyst for over a decade and also is the co-founder of Gainline Analytics. Simon, thanks for coming on.
No worries, no worries. Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome, cool. Look, really looking forward to this episode. Look, as always, we try to start off with the person that we're speaking to. So can you tell us a bit about yourself?
So I've had a pretty convoluted pathway into what I'm doing now. So I originally, my original background is as a designer. So I actually spent 10 years as a car designer with Holden. And that was my original training, but I've always been involved in sport, like as most people have been, and as a player and as a coach.
Yeah.
And so I was lucky enough to get involved in rugby pathways. So my background's in rugby pathway coaching. And then through there, that's where I had the association with getting involved with the Wallabies and then through other clubs. But with the background in design, it actually allowed me to have a different perspective on the way to look at things. So if anyone that understands design or knows design, there's a thing called the design process about how you actually come up with ideas. And it's actually a very, very powerful tool, regardless of how you approach things, about the methods of coming up with ideas and how you slowly filter them through and actually coming up with a final solution. So it's actually been very beneficial for me in everything I've done, whether that was designing a Monaro or a Commodore, to actually coming up with ideas around sports analytics or designing a website or doing all those sort of other aspects as well. So even though it's a completely different field, there are definitely crossovers.
Awesome. Okay. And look, obviously at one point you had to transition from the world of design to, I guess, to formally starting to work with the Rebels and the Wallabies. Can you tell us a little bit about that transition and how you first got your crack into the industry?
Yeah. So basically what happened is that when I was working as a designer, I was involved in coaching, and if you put your hand up for enough of the crappy jobs, so to speak, then a good one comes along. And it was literally can someone hold a camera? The Wallabies are in Melbourne, so I'm based in Melbourne. The Wallabies are in Melbourne. Can someone hold a camera at training? And it was like, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And so it literally went from holding a camera at one training to, can you come back tomorrow? Yeah, no worries. Okay, this is how we input it into the computer. No worries. What are you doing Saturday? Oh, well, I was going to come and watch the game. We'll come into the game and we'll get you the video, and then we'll get you to input it in, and I'll show you how to clip. And then it was a case of, well, what are you doing next year? Oh, well, I'm going to be doing this. I'm going to be around. Well, come and do it. And then it literally went from there to basically understanding the nuts and bolts of being a video analyst, a performance analyst in that environment, touring with the Wallabies, through to the toured with the Lions tour in 2013. And then from that association, it was Ben Darwin, who was the video analyst at the Melbourne Rebels when they were starting up. He helped out the Wallabies for one test and said, well, if you can do this with the Wallabies, can you help me out at the Rebels? And this was me. This wasn't my full-time gig. I was passionate. I'm passionate. I love rugby, and it was anything I could do to be involved. And so I basically was literally fifth in the office at the Rebels, clipping players from Europe or Shoot Shield or from the NPC, just so they could get their initial squad. And that basically gave me the basic skills of understanding, what it is to be a video analyst. And this was back in the day before there were performance analyst courses, Master of Analytics. It was literally, who's the next person who can do the job? It was the IT guy or someone left over.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, look, obviously, you almost fell into that role then a little bit in terms of being.
And a lot of guys, like the guy I worked for at the Wallabies, that's basically what he did. There's a lot of guys through that generation I was involved, that it was almost, and that was back in the day when the sort of video analyst, performance analyst was just starting out as a profession, and it was almost peripheral in a way. And it was like, oh, we need someone to do it. Oh, who can do it?
Yeah.
And there wasn't necessarily a lot of focus on skills other than who can work your computer, because you end up being the IT guy.
Yeah.
As well. I still go in my work bag. I still go around with a bag of HDMI cables and other plugs and everything, because you never know. You rock up to a new stadium,
yeah,
and the coach goes in there and says, I need a cable for this. And that's part of your job is,
right,
you're a problem solver as well. and that side of it. So, I still hold on to those things now.
Nice. Okay. Well, I guess if you fast forward almost a decade now, how has the role of a video analyst evolved over that time?
Yeah. So I think probably across a lot of sports. Well, now there's a lot more data involved. Yeah. So there's a role of a video analyst or a performance analyst, which is part of capturing the data. But then what do you do with the data? And that was a lot of difference, I think, now between when I started and what happens now. There is so much more activity around with what you do with that data and how you treat the data. And even now, back in the day, it was video cameras capturing onto computers and clipping. How you do that now, like these days, you don't even need that. It can be video, it can be AI that basically does people recognition, can automatically code these things. Different sports are different. Trying to code what a ruck and a maul looks like in rugby is completely different. AI is going to have to go a long way before they can work that out. But the technology's increased. But then the output, what do you do with the output now? There's so much more that you can look at, and then so much more you can analyze. As opposed to just spreadsheets and check boxes that it used to be.
Right. And look, a bit of a side question. I've heard a similar sort of answer from people in other industries in Australia, but look, obviously with coronavirus, our growth is going to be stunted to an extent over the next year or two. But do you think there's a long way to go in terms of we've gone from just having a guy holding a camera and sort of clipping to having a whole heap of data available? But do you still think there's a long way to go in terms of getting the most out of what we could do with the data?
That's a really good question, because it depends what you want to get out of it, because you can go down the extremes of what you want to do with the data. You can go down the Moneyball example. Obviously, Moneyball, had its time and its place, but there are plenty of examples in the modern day how people have taken that to the extreme. If anyone knows the story of Fulham Football Club, Fulham's just been promoted into the Premiership, but a few years ago they had their owner brought on the son of the owner brought on an analytics guy out of the US. Yeah. He was a very, very Moneyball focused guy that ended up being literally escorted out of the building by the police. It's a great story if anyone wants to Google it. But it's how you treat the data and what you do with it is the important side of it, and how the organisation is going to take it. So, and a really good example of that, you only have to look at sort of the LinkedIn profiles of all the head of the sort of the data analyst guys in a lot of the US sports, and it's all statistics out of Stanford or Harvard, and that's where the push was previously. It's around that real data, strong data focus. Yeah. But the question is, what is the data ultimately? What is the data giving you? There was a book called Astro Ball around the Houston Astros, which was a really good story until you find out that the Houston Astros have been cheating about videoing the opposition. So they had this really good philosophy about soft analytics. You have the data, but then you have people in unison with it to make soft decisions around the hard data, so to speak. So it was a really good story from that perspective, and that's the way that, from my perspective, needs to be going forward around how you treat the data in itself. And that's going to be transitional and generational with people who are coming into the coaching and organisational ranks of sports teams are now going to be growing up with data, and then how you choose to use that going forward.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I think we're naturally veering onto the subject of data analytics, and I think you've already mentioned Ben. So, we've obviously have Ben. We've had Ben on the podcast before, but in 2014 you started Gainline Analytics with Ben Darwin. How did you guys meet, and how did the idea for the company come about?
So yeah, Ben and I met, and like I said before, when he was just starting out of the Rebels, and we met through that time at the Wallabies, and then so I spent a couple of years working with him at the Melbourne Rebels when he was head performance analyst and scrum coach there. Then he went overseas. He coached in Japan for a couple of seasons, and then I stayed back at the Rebels doing my thing. Again, it wasn't a full-time gig; it was just part-time for me. I was just happy to clean people's boots at the club, but the fact that I was in that particular area was good for me because I was also a coach. But so when Ben came back from Japan, he actually was coaching the team where and he may have told you this story, but they had an undefeated season, but he still got fired. And he just said, I don't really want to be a professional coach anymore, because it's a hard life to maintain sort of the constant moving and so forth. But he had an idea around a business which was selling player contract data to rugby teams.
Yeah.
So instead of having a multitude of coaches, scouts around, you can actually go to our database or the database and say, we've got this player coming off contract. Here's his contract history. Here's his agent. So it's just easier that way. So he was starting that business, and that's when he said, I've got this idea for a business. Do you want to come on board and help? And it was like, yeah, no worries, because I was transitioning out of my time as a car designer. I actually became a school teacher for a period of time.
Right.
And I was a director of rugby at a school here in Melbourne, or a teacher in charge of rugby, because I really wanted to focus on that side and the sports side. And that gave me the opportunity, because strangely enough, or not surprisingly enough, I couldn't necessarily see a future with the Australian car industry. So that's why I wanted to move. But so I was helping Ben put that business together, that business idea. But then we pivoted when we started to see some of the trends around how teams were recruiting. And that's when we started to develop these ideas around cohesion or cohesion analytics,
right?
Which was something that, and I'm sure if people went back and listened to your previous chat with Ben, they'd probably get the idea around those concepts of cohesion analytics. But it was that relationship we had previously at the Rebels, and then moving in to working together, creating Gainline Analytics, forming the company, and doing all those nuts and bolts around actually how to start a business from that side from about 2014.
Right. Awesome. Okay, cool. And look, obviously it's been more than 5 years now. So what have been a couple of the key moments for the business when it's really taken off, and what sets Gainline Analytics I guess apart from other players in the industry?
Yeah, key moments. That's a really good question, actually. We've like a lot of other startup businesses, we've seen everyone. Normally everyone's got a really good idea. Other people, go to the market and get a lot of investment and try and make a glossy turnkey product and go out there, and people go to incubators and get VC capital, and which is your typical story. We chose not to go down that path. We chose to grow organically because we saw failings in that system. Because you might have 100 good ideas and only 5% of them might work, which means 95 good ideas failed because they didn't meet the VC criteria, or they couldn't scale up, even if they were a good idea in that way. And so we sort of chose to grow organically in that way because we had the capability to do that. So we've developed our sort of our client base and sort of getting a reputation over time. And during that, we've been able to secure funding from investors and people who are invested in us. This is not about a 10x, 20x return at some stage. These are people that say, I absolutely understand what you guys are saying, and I understand the way you're doing it, and I want to be part of this for the long run. So I think probably the most pivotal time for us was that first investment period, where it's essentially validation from the outside. We always felt that we had a strong idea, and we could see it in our data, and we could see it when we sat down with people and explained their situation and gave them an understanding about why they were successful or why they failed. Yeah. So once you have that validation through the way we went around our investment, because of the type of people we're getting, I think that was a really pivotal time, because that enabled us to get that runway to really enhance what we're doing.
Right.
Yep. And in respect to what we're doing different to the rest of the market, I suppose I touched on this before. There's around the collection of data. There is a lot of data these days. Majority of sports analytics is that data that happens from the game, the event data, what's happened in the game, and then trying to look at that and understand how is the team playing. Is this person a talented player? And it's almost it's after the event, so to speak, to try and actually look about what were the outcomes of the game. So we've taken a completely different viewpoint, and we're trying to look at what are the inputs into that environment. We use the terminology cohesion, or the objective understanding between players. It's not the only influence of outcomes. There's obviously talent, there's obviously coaching, but we feel that this is a really strong influence on performance, and it's an underestimated one. So if you have a bunch of talented players and you have a coaching plan, if they don't have a level of understanding, they can't necessarily achieve their goals.
Yeah.
You can't necessarily have a context to that performance. So that's what we try, and that's basically what the work we do, is actually give that context to it, and then allow clubs to understand, how do you then do that? How do you become the Melbourne Storm or the Canterbury Crusaders, or the Sydney Swans or Geelong over that period of time? The New England Patriots. What is about the way they recruit, they select within their organisation that creates this long-term sustainable success? So that's what we've chosen to do, and it's really a governance piece, but it also allows us to understand what's happening on the field from that sort of that granular level as well.
Right. I think from our conversation last week and hearing you sort of crystallize those thoughts again today, it's really refreshing as a sporting fan just to hear you speak, compared to sort of watching the media and literally like a team will have one bad result and then that's it, the coach is gone or whatever. Like that short-term thinking versus what you're saying. Really refreshing to hear.
Yeah, and look, and I've literally had two conversations earlier today, one with a former AFL coach and one with a former NBA player, around similar things of understanding that context of performance. If we had that context, how would have that reflected on my coaching previously? And likewise, in the NBA as well, how does that reflect on individuals' performance as well as teams' performance? I mean, we believe that the majority of coaching and manager firings, managers in football, are not done in context. That it's the relationship to the cohesion of the team, not relationship to performance.
Right.
And that's the whole dynamic. That's why we believe, what we say is that we've got this governance piece to enable the governance of an organisation to get an objective understanding of what's happening in the organisation, as opposed to that gut feel that's happened that they've had in the past.
Sure. And look, this is almost a bit of a silly question because it's so broad, but I want you to think of it in terms of the people that are obviously listening or watching this afterwards that are, outsiders to the sporting industry or don't have that much involvement. So you've spent 5 or 6 years now, obviously heavily involved through Gainline Analytics and speaking to sporting stakeholders, different codes at different levels, right? So during that time, if we're just looking at the Australian sporting industry, how have you seen, I guess, the evolution of the attitude or the mindset towards sports analytics?
That's a really good question. It's kind of ironic that you travel the world, and I've done this. I've been in NFL clubs in the US.
Yeah.
And someone says you're Australian, all of a sudden there's an Aussie. Oh, g'day, how you going? And normally though, these guys are S&C, strength and conditioning, because the reputation of Australian S&C around the world is massive. Like you get people like Darren Burgess, who's now back at Melbourne Football Club, but he was at Arsenal. Like right. The reputation of those guys is immense. And there's, through the advent of the AIS back in the day and the amount of work that went into that side of sports science has given the Australians reputations around the world. So from that side, it's really, really strong. But it's not necessarily, the reputation is not as strong from the sports analytics side right. as much. But then it's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think if Australian sport went down the path of maybe what US sport has done, because they've really gone, they've really pushed the data side without necessarily understanding. Having a lot of data is great, but what do we do with that data? So, potentially, hopefully there's a trickle-down effect where it does come into Australian sport, but more of in a controlled, understood fashion, as opposed to, here's a big data dump, now what do I do with it in that way? But having worked in environments, I know that there's sports in Australia that definitely don't use it. I mean, there's a lot of sports. AFL is a really good example of, there's so many smart guys out in the AFL community that are really, really the ability to look at a lot of data and actually get something out of it. And how much of that's actually done in the clubs themselves? Probably a little bit, but there's still, unlike in the US, where they publish the NFL, the NBA, they publish all their stats and people can go crazy on it. It's very different in Australia, where it's sort of compartmentalized. There's probably a lot of guys that could actually benefit a lot of the clubs really, really well, but it's all closed in. But in saying that, there's still a lot of people. There's still a lot of people that just publish here's the average score from the last 20 years. But that's not going to help the coach.
Yeah.
Going into Ken Hinckley and telling him that their ELO rating predicted that they were going to win or lose, it's not going to help Ken Hinckley's state of mind.
Yeah.
It's not going to tell him how he's going to win the next game, so to speak. So there's sort of a balance to it.
Right. And just from a longer term view, so I've only really started to get involved in the industry in the last 6 to 12 months. But if you look at it as a block of the last, say, 5 or 6 years, has there been a change or like are people in the industry a bit more open to, using the data and seeing what information the data is providing them in Australia?
Yeah, definitely open. If you were closed, I think you'd if you were closed to the data, you'd basically, like, that's pretty old school.
Yeah.
And that's the difference between and you get this listening, and media, television wants people to enjoy the telecast, but potentially a lot of the stuff you get given on that is sort of opinion, and it's opinion by experienced people, but is it a really true reflection of what's happening on the ground, so to speak? And I'll give you a rugby example. There's a guy named Squidgy Rugby who does these really fantastic analysis of game outcomes of games, and he does it just off his own bat, and it's really insightful stuff. You don't really get that in sort of the modern media because I don't know if it's a clickbait thing, but there's a lot of emotive commentary where I think a lot of people are probably asking for something a little bit more deeper when it comes to the data, and where things like second screen technology, basically you can watch the game and you can have your iPad where it's pumping out a whole bunch of stats on there as well. But as far as the clubs go, if you're not open to data, then you're going to go backwards.
Right. Okay. And I think when we spoke to Ben for the podcast, I think it was in March or April, so about 4 months ago now. I guess with the impact of coronavirus, obviously, or worldwide, but obviously on Australian sport, are there any key changes that you guys have, I guess, had to make to adapt and to flourish, hopefully longer term, because of that?
Yeah. So one of the things about the way we work, because each organisation is different, we've really had to be a sort of a face-to-face organisation to get in the room and explain what we do and how we do it, because it's very contextual to an organisation. Who is the person that controls the things that we talk about? Because it might be different. In some organisations, it might be the head coach rules the roost. In others, it might be the director of football. In others, it might be the CEO. So in the past, we've always had to get into the room to really understand some of the nuances in the organisation to get our message across. Now, of course, that's changed, and that's in sport, that's in corporate as well. So we do a lot of work in the corporate area as well. So that's not happening at the moment. So we've been hit pretty hard by COVID, just like every other. I'm sure every other sport data provider and a lot of other people. And so that's sort of affected our business model at the moment, but also our sort of sales cycle, not being able to necessarily get in front of people for future opportunities.
Yeah.
So one of the things we did do is that we started a webinar series as a way to try and broaden our base and try and get revenue from a different audience, so to speak. So in the past, we really aimed for the sort of the top tier of the sporting community, but then when we thought about it, is that what we do is really applicable to anyone trying to put a team together in any competition. And so we created a webinar series and try and open that up to allow essentially anybody that wanted to understand the principles in that way. So obviously, webinar series online, we do it sort of one-on-one, so it's not just pre-recorded. So there's questions and answers. So we try and make it as personal as possible, but by doing that, we wanted to sort of broaden the base. And being online, like these days, that's nothing different from what anybody's doing, and people get used to it. So that's one of the things we've done. And then just through the downtime, which is the unfortunate downtime for us, has given us some opportunities to make some other relationships and take us into some other areas and potentially build for when we can switch on
Right.
later on. So we've got some good clients that have stuck with us over the period of time, and we're building on developing some other relationships, and then obviously going online as well.
Right. Okay. And look, obviously, it's been a tough time for not just people in the industry, but people obviously trying to crack into the industry. Like, you know, if you're someone that's just in a master's of high performance sport or completing a PhD, it's extremely tough time to get a gig in the industry. Is there any advice that you'd give out to people that are new to the industry and trying to, you know, get their first opportunity, whether it's an internship or a full-time gig, anything that would help, I guess, set them apart from the 100 other resumes that are going to be on the table nowadays?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My advice would be for anyone trying to get any job is that it's easier to get a job if you've got a recommendation about your ability to do a job. So, and if that might be if you want to work for an AFL club, that you volunteer at a VFL club or even below that. If you can get someone to say this person does a good job, then that weighs as much as, you know, a high distinction on your academic record.
Yeah.
Having a high distinction on your academic record and forgetting to press record on the camera before the start of the game, I'd rather have someone who can press record, which I've done a number of times, which is the worst feeling in the world as a video analyst, forgetting to press record.
Yeah.
And then having to go to the broadcast van to try and coax it out of the broadcaster for the first 5 minutes of the game. So it's really about trying to get some level of experience in that way, trying to basically get runs on the board. And it doesn't matter what it is. If you can do your job, if you can problem solve, if people they know they can rely on you, then that's the key, I believe, to it. So, but then obviously having a good understanding of the requirements, you know, having the skill set, whether that's a performance analyst side or from the data side, is obviously critical as well. And being able to ask questions or being self-reliant, I think is a really, really important one. Not sitting there saying, is this what you want? Is this what you want? Is this what you want? I've done this and I've done this and also found this other way, which I took it this way and has potentially found this. It may not be useful, but there's a potentially path to go down. So it's like, instead of you ask me for what 3 + 1 is, 3.5 isn't right. I've given you 5. I know you wanted 4, but let's go with 5 and see what happens.
Right.
So, and that's from my experience of being on one end of it, being that person trying to make 5, and also being on the other end where someone's given me 3.5.
Yeah. No, awesome.
So, yeah.
I think just on that note, you know, one thing that I keep hearing from people that I speak to in the sports science world is that, and look, I'm biased because I've got my sort of tech recruitment background and the whole world of data science and analytics I find extremely interesting. But they keep saying that you're going to have to wear different hats to survive in the industry now.
Yeah.
Longer term, it's going to be difficult if you want to be a specialist. But
Yeah.
I guess, you know, running a company called K-Line Analytics, if you've got someone who's trying to get their first sort of gig in the industry, what is it from a data point of view at the junior level that you find really helpful? Like if someone's coming to you and saying, hey, I've got a master's degree and I'm looking for an internship or I'm looking for a casual role or whatever, what do you look for at that junior level when people are trying to crack into the industry?
Initiative. It's really initiative. It's I suppose it comes back to mine that 3 + 1 analogy, so to speak. It's around initiative. It is someone who if you say, show me this, and they come back with, it's this plus also this, it's sort of not the minimum amount. So it's really that case of showing initiative, the ability to get the job done. And I'm slightly biased. When I was a designer with Holden, I wasn't the best designer. There were guys there that were so much better than me, and I had imposter syndrome every time I went to work. But what I did do is get things done, and people could rely on me, that they knew if I had a project, that it would be done and, you know, done to its best. Within the car industry, that meant within price, within engineering specs, and all those other things that go with it.
Right.
So I'm sort of biased in that work view in that way around making sure that it's around the initiative and making sure that the work can be done. It doesn't have to be flashy. It just basically but it needs to make sure that there is investment by the person that's doing it, and they're not just doing the task.
Right. Awesome. Cool. Well, look, that'll be super helpful. Look, as always, Simon, we'll leave a link to your profile. So if anyone wants to reach out and sort of, network with you, they can. But look, I really appreciate your time. Super interesting on our end, and we'll get it over social media and the website over the next couple of days.
No worries. I look forward to it. Thank you very much for your time. And yeah, good luck to you guys as well during this period. I know it's hard for everyone and everyone else that's listening, but yeah, we'll all get through it. And then hopefully on the other side, everything will be rosy and back to normal.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Alrighty.
Thanks, Simon. Cheers.
Hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to check out more of our content, go to sporttechdaily.com or follow us on social media across Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram.